Grim morning and welcome to the Grim. I'm your host, Kristen. On today's episode, we'll be opening the gate and entering Greenwood Memorial Terrace, located in Spokane, Washington. So grab your favorite mug, cozy up, and let's take a dig into history. We've been close, but we haven't yet opened a gate on the West Coast this season, and today we're going to be rectifying that in Spokane. The Pacific Northwest is a lush landscape filled with beautiful woodlands and majestic sights, so it's no surprise that one of their cemeteries wouldn't be any different. Greenwood was established in 1888 and fashioned after Europe's grand Victorian gardens and for the general public to enjoy refined outdoor family leisure. Today it lives up to the grandeur of a Victorian graveyard but with a more spacious feel. The grounds feature winding paths defining the natural landscape with spring-fed fountains and a waterfall, once again having visitors in awe forgetting their grounds serve a grave purpose. Greenwood, however, was established to help an ever-growing city's problem, for providing a space for its deceased, which may seem odd considering Spokane was a frontier town, but the overload of those seeking opportunities in mining, the railroad, and timber was greater than the city was built for. The West Coast in the late 1800s was part of America's frontier and promised land for those hoping to amass a fortune or to spend it. The only problem was the original small pioneer cemeteries, once on the edge of town, weren't able to handle this new population. Many were built over unknowingly or sadly destroyed from the need for more housing and development. Businessman A.M. Cannon and a few other prominent members of Spokane's society sought a remedy for this problem. They purchased and donated the land just west of town for Spokane's first modern burial site, establishing Greenwood as one of the West Coast's first elegant garden cemeteries. Like many cities also during this time in America's history, Spokane was experiencing the City Beautiful movement. Driven mainly by the upper middle class, this saw the redesign or beautification of cities in an attempt to redevelop poor living conditions and create a more urban, grandeur city. This was more prominent in cities like Cleveland, Detroit, Kansas City, and Washington, D.C., and Chicago, where the World's Fair was taking place in 1893. Chicago was the driving force with hosting the World's Fair, creating the White City with modern transport systems and no poverty visible to visitors. Other cities immediately followed its lead like Spokane, seeing its population grow in cities beautifully redesigned. Greenwood's establishment in 1888 saw its design being heavily influenced by this and can still be seen to this day. The cemetery is fashioned in 3 separate terraces in an expansive wooded setting. The first terrace starts with the flats on the lowest level. Greenwood's offices can be found here along with a few memorials and headstones, varying in design, showing the changes over time. Headstones range from an upright old-fashioned to ostentatious or ornate from the Royal Garden era. The next terrace is known as the Bench. This is where many of Spokane's high society can be found and where the best view of the city was. Ironically, its establishment of the best view faded over time from trees growing, and now the top has this honor. Then the last is the top terrace, where visitors can see breathtaking views of the city and a giant white cement cross of inspiration that was erected in 1961, where each year an interdenominational Easter service is held, along with other events. The first burial on the grounds was of Mrs. H.F. Nothbaum on July 1st of 1888. Yet Greenwood didn't have just new burials to take over from the old pioneer cemeteries. Nearby Old Mountain View Cemetery and Morum Prairie Cemetery had bodies disinterred and reburied within Greenwood. Around 50 bodies are believed to have been removed from Old Mountain View and an unknown number from Morum Prairie. Greenwood's residents are quite an array of souls that went looking for new lives in America's Great West. Only one buried within is one of America's real daughters, which, listeners, I was unfamiliar with this term upon doing research. So for those listeners like me, I'll also explain what a real daughter of America is. A real daughter is a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution who was a biological daughter of the DAR, qualifying ancestor and distinguished because she was a DAR member as well as the actual daughter of a soldier or patriot. Only 767 women could claim this distinction, with Isabel Johnson Savage Conway being one of them, buried within Greenwood Memorial Terrace. Conway was the daughter of Patriot Philip Johnson, who fought under George Washington in the Revolutionary War. She recalled war tales of her father and two companions while retreating needing to swim across shark-infested water, with one perishing being killed by a shark during the crossing. Then also retelling her mother's tale, who apparently was much younger than her father, hiding in a damp pit covered by brush when the family heard British soldiers approaching. Conway originally was married living in New York and then Michigan, but after her first husband's passing, moved to Spokane, Washington. This is where she then married Patrick Peter Conway, but had several misfortunes in business. She bought the Old Railroad Hotel and also ran the Leland Hotel, with both hotels being lost to fires, but thankfully being insured. Conway, though, saw the loss of her brother Charles Johnson from the fire, of one being unable to escape, being an invalid, and was suffocated by the smoke. In July 14th of 1915, the Liberty Bell came to Spokane, and Conway had a particular interest in being photographed with the bell. She eventually convinced an officer she was a real daughter, and they allowed her to take a picture while touching the bell, which normally wasn't allowed. Those present recall her saying on the platform of the rail car that there was a papillate clicking of Kodaks while taking her picture. A few months later, on October 4th of 1915, Conway passed at the age of 79. At the time of her death, she was active as the chaplain of the Daughters of Veterans and vice president of the Ladies of the Grand Army of the Republic. Conway's passing saw her estate valued at over $35,000, estimated to be over $1 million today. She was a great businesswoman, having listed properties in Odessa, Oakdale, Pasco, Spokane, and valuable farm properties in Lincoln and Whitman County, and her personal estate consisting of notes, mining stocks, and cash in the bank. Her Daughters of the American Revolution application, however, did have controversy, with her name listed as Isabel versus Isabella. Her husband and sons are all buried in Fairmount Cemetery nearby. For those listeners who were fans of the popular 90s Game Oregon Trail, you'll be happy to hear of pioneer Lorenzo Wesley, or L.W. Rima. Rima was originally born in Illinois in 1843, where his family years later decided to try their luck moving west to Minnesota Territory in 1855. Reading of Rima's life, it almost feels like replaying the Oregon Trail game, which back in these days, anything west of the Mississippi River was considered frontier at the time. He spent much of his life living out of a wagon or tent living in the West. Rima then decided in 1868 to go even further west to Alexandria, Douglas County in Minnesota. This is where he started a sawmill shingle business, became a charter member of a Constellation Masonic Lodge, and then built a homestead on 80 acres of land for his sweetheart, Martha Rush. His life on the western frontier was filled with Indian skirmishes during the day, studying at night, then also building his own violin and teaching himself to play. Rush and Rima finally married, but sadly, Martha's health failed her. Thinking Oregon might be helpful, they set out again westward in late of 1876. Less than a year later, almost, in 1877, Martha passed in Monmouth, Oregon on March 7th, leaving Rima a childless widower. Fittingly, Rima once again decided to move to Washington Territory, where records show he occupied space on Front Street in Spokane, opening the city's first jewelry store. His years of studying surveying finally paid off, and he performed the first formal survey of Spokane Falls and laid it out as a town. Rimmer laid out 20 blocks, establishing the basic orientation of streets that all subsequent subdividers would follow in the city. In 1879, he also saw the loss of one of his stores he built on Howard Street to a fire, then rebuilding the building in all brick in 1883, where it was later called the Rimmer Block. This sadly also did burn down in 1889, but was then rebuilt. The block does exist today, where Mizuma Restaurant stands part of 3 adjoined historic buildings. It's now known today as the Bennett Block. Rima in Spokane ran businesses conducting surveys, oversaw the building of Howard Street Bridge, helped found the first library, developed the first telephone line, was the first to record daily weather, and more. He was a pioneer and a vital part of Spokane's development as a city. On January 4th, his life was tragically cut short at the age of 41, dying from pneumonia. He left his entire estate to his father, worth $35,000, over $1 million today. Rima, being one of the first pioneers of Spokane, was thought to originally be buried in Old Mountain View Cemetery, but then moved to Greenwood upon its establishment in 1888. His grave is one of the oldest in the cemetery. When you think of the old Wild West, you think of Texas, Tombstone, and the gold rush in California. But many forget the Pacific Northwest was just as wild and in need of lawmen. I know I've been referring to Spokane as it's named modernly today, but back in the late 1800s, the city was known as Spokane Falls in the territory of Washington with only 1,000 residents. In 1881, the town was without a marshal, however, and needed one immediately. Greenwood Memorial resident Eugene Hyde had his job cut out for him, being the city's first marshal after being appointed by Robert W. Forrest, the town's first appointed mayor. Hyde became the first elected marshal or chief of police in 1883, holding the position till 1885. Ironically, Hyde was first involved in the real estate business when he first moved to Spokane Falls in 1881. Then, after being the town marshal, was elected as an alderman who had a failed attempt to become the town mayor in 1887, but in 1891 was elected to the state senate. He and his wife left Spokane in 1912 for a more mild climate due to his health declining and then passing away in 1917. His body was then returned to Spokane and interred in Greenwood Memorial Terrace. In front of his grave is a monument thanking him for his service. One of Spokane's richest men is also a resident in Greenwood, Edward James Bricknell. Bricknell originally was from Illinois and encouraged to visit Spokane by businessman A.M. Cannon in 1881. He ended up purchasing land adding up to a total of 3,000 acres and taking his business out west. Bricknell, along with two others, founded Holly Mason Marks & Co., the largest hardware firm in the inland Northwest in 1883. Then, in 1884, with A.M. Cannon and several others, formed the Spokane Falls Lumber and Manufacturing Co. Bricknell transformed the lumber company into the Spokane Mill Co. in 1886 that during its existence became the largest employer in Spokane during its time. Bricknell was also one of the founders and presidents of Traders National Bank, founder and president of Spokane Mill Company, president of Holly Mason Marks & Co., Spokane Falls Water Power Company, Baum & Co., a painting business, Spokane Bottle Company, and the Old Dominion and Columbia Mining Company. Passing in September 23rd of 1891, his friend Cannon was quoted saying, "His vim and energy brought the city to life. He was always willing to give his aid and advance capital to establish any enterprise that would advance the interests of Spokane as a commercial and business center. As a man, he was always charitable, and no deserving person ever left his door as poor as when they entered." Bricknell's funeral process was quoted the most imposing ever witnessed in the city, with his funeral proceeding over a mile long. It featured a brass band at the lead, with the Masons and Odd Fellows dressed in elaborate costumes, and his black-plumed hearse being followed by 68 carriages. Now, listeners, I'm not a Washington native, so if you're finding the Pacific Northwest intriguing, you might also be interested in spirits and monsters of old Seattle. I'll be back in a moment for more history and hauntings of Greenwood after this short clip from our West Coast friends.
The year is 1888, and we find ourselves in the far-flung corner of the United States, called the Pacific Northwest, in the two small towns of Seattle and Ballard. Under rainy gray skies and among the giant old-growth pine forests, there are secrets hiding, invisible to most people, except for those with the second sight. Join us for a new actual play podcast called Spirits and Monsters of Old Seattle. My name is Brian Kershaw, and I'll be your host and game master for this trip into a supernatural Seattle. My friends and I will be playing a role playing game called Fossum. Our show is a mixture of comedy and horror, and we would love for you to join us. You can find episodes at spiritsandmonsters.com or follow and subscribe for new episodes every other Wednesday on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you like to listen to podcasts. We can't wait for you to join us.
Welcome back to the Grim, and going back to a famous resident who helped create a nationally observed holiday. Greenwood is also home to the creator of Father's Day, Serena Dodd. Growing up on a farm in Wilbur, Washington, Dodd's mother passed away when she was 16. She then, being the only daughter, helped her father raise her brothers, holding her father in high regard. After hearing the newly established Mother's Day during a church sermon, Dodd felt fathers also needed to be recognized and spoke to the Spokane Ministerial Alliance, suggesting her own father's birthday, June 5th, for Father's Day. They then decided the third Sunday of June instead, but the first Father's Day was celebrated June 19th in 1910 in Spokane, Washington. Many observed the holiday till the 1920s. Till in 1966, Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Presidential Proclamation, declaring the third Sunday of June as Father's Day. It officially became a permanently national observed day by President Nixon in 1972. Dodd was honored at the World's Fair in Spokane in 1974 for the observed holiday, then passed 4 years later at the age of 96 in 1978. Life in the Wild West on the frontier was a hard life. Many times reading about a person's past accomplishments so full and varied, you can forget how many of the struggles they faced in life. Walter Lawson, a Buffalo soldier and Spokane police officer who resides within Greenwood, is one of those tales. Life on the frontier was hard, but life as an African American on the frontier was even harder. Out of Greenwood's residence, Walter Lawson, known as Walker, had an impressive life and is one I really wanted listeners to know of. You see, Walker originally was from Virginia and served as a private in the 25th Infantry Regiment in the Indian Wars from 1886 to 1891 in Montana. His regiment was a segregated unit of African American soldiers, which was nicknamed by the Native American tribes Buffalo Soldiers. During his service, the 25th Infantry was stationed in the Dakotas, Minnesota, and Montana, where they took part of the Ghost Dance War in 1890 that involved the massacre of Wounded Knee. This was an absolute dark time in America's history. We just fought the Civil War, but African Americans years before and after dealt with segregation and extremely unfair treatment. But the other side of this was also America's policy and treatment of the Native Americans, something equally worse and damning in our history. I'm not a professional writer or historian, so I feel conveying the gravity of either party's treatment is beneath me. But I hope listeners know it's an ugly, disgusting history that hurts to read of, let alone know anyone experienced. Walker was in the middle of history that would easily break many spirits of Americans today, but he prospered. After the war, going on to become a cowboy in Montana and finding love with Amelia Millie Langford. Walker and his wife came to Spokane in 1894, where he became a porter in a hotel. A few years later, in 1899, he would find his true calling, becoming a special police officer working for the Spokane Police Department. He then later became a patrolman, a wagon driver, and then, near the end of his career, the department's official driver of the new automobile. Sadly, he fell ill from acute intestinal disorder, in 1917, passing away just 6 days after being on duty. Walker, at the time of his passing, had the honor of having a badge number 4, meaning he was the 4th longest tenured officer on the police force. He was respected, fearless, and remarkable in the line of duty. Even with the prejudice and hardships he endured, he never lost his self-control, and his police captain was quoted saying he would go anywhere and his record as a policeman was above average. Also saying Walter was a rare fellow who never intruded anywhere and he was well liked by all of us. We admired him not only as a man but as a faithful and brave officer. After his passing, a news article was published about him, stating he was one of the bravest officers who ever wore the blue or swung a nightstick. Walker was the only officer of African American descent serving as a policeman on the West Coast during his time. His accomplishments, high decorum in life, gives us a large reminder that no matter what life gives you, it's what you make of it. Walker was a member of the Inland Empire Lodge of Colored Masons and the Eastern Star. Just as cities rise and fall, so do its residents, none more so than Anthony McHugh Cannon, who also was known as A.M. Cannon in Spokane Falls. Cannon originally came to Spokane in 1878 and was one of its founding fathers. He first moved into a simplistic rustic cabin that would be short-lived, needing more space for his wife and 5 children. Constructing what would become Spokane's finest-looking home, he was just getting started, with his mark on the city. He quickly amassed a great wealth from businesses and the establishment of Spokane's first bank in the city, then sought to dramatically upgrade his home to display his opulent wealth. Cannon then constructed a huge Victorian-style mansion, the first in the city, with central heating system, gas lighting, and bathtubs. Yet Cannon didn't stop there. The mansion had custom mahogany accent flooring with a parquet design, horse stables also made of mahogany, and a fountain in the front yard. The display was one of opulence and splendor to all passing by in the city. He, however, didn't get to enjoy his creation for long, with the Panic of 1893 crippling his finances. Cannon's assets were seized with all his businesses and him going to New York in the end. He tragically died penniless in a hotel in New York and was taken back to Spokane, where he lays to rest in Greenwood. Spokane has a street, hill, park, city pool, and a Planet Edition, all sporting the Cannon name in his honor. His opulent mansion, however, didn't survive due to a fire in 1937, and his other houses were since torn down. Greenwood's lengthy and pioneer intertwined history within its pine-lined pathways is one surely filled with hauntings, rightly so. Beyond the grounds, now on private property, sits an old staircase into the terrace. These stairs are claimed to be so haunted that not many who have attempted to climb them make it to the top. Nicknamed the Thousand Steps, it's claimed you'll hear the shrieks and cries of the dead, all while it feels as if raindrops hit your skin but there's no rain, while climbing the steps. But this has to be done without light. And if that doesn't deter you when you reach the top, you'll see the faces of men, women, and children that have all passed away. The steps were part of the purchase from the Elks Club, whose mausoleum sits near the top. The organization originally paid for the steps and a gardener to tend to the exotic plants around them, but went bankrupt. A once life-size bronze statue of an elk sat at the top of the mausoleum but was sold to cover the remaining debts. The steps then fell in disrepair, looking extremely creepy and are very unsafe today. Just in case you're wondering, there's only 60 steps, not 1,000 to the top. Rumors of satanic rituals taking place in the grounds also abound, but there's no proof that these claims exist. Greenwood's partake in the 1974 World's Fair saw many renovations and the cemetery ceding an easement from its western boundary for a new rail line into the city. Local legends of claims of laborers dying during the construction of a tunnel beneath the cemetery haunt the grounds. Some say the laborers who died on site during the construction, the railway had their bodies burned right then and there. Some say the buried train cars even have the possibility of buried treasure. No one, however, has been able to uncover if the tales are true since the overgrowth of vegetation, thus erasing the tunnel's original existence. So we'll just have to go by local folklore for now. The Pacific Northwest may seem like grounds for nature, hiking, and modern-day cities, but it's still filled with rich history from its past. Greenwood Memorial Terrace is one of those places, serving as a reminder of those who settled the city and created what we see today. A worthy stroll through its lush gardens into its pioneer past, its history dark, inspiring, and even heartwarming at times. So if you find yourself in the Pacific Northwest, or if you're a local, I hope you find yourself at Greenwood Memorial's Terrace gates, appreciating its history and residents a little more. The grave grind for Greenwood Memorial Terrace was a lemon vanilla latte from Igdaba Coffee in Spokane, Washington. For more honorary grinds in the area, please visit the-grim.com. For now, we're closing the gate on Greenwood Memorial Terrace. We hope you enjoyed our dig into history. If you did, subscribe today to join us next time when we open the gate on the Grin.